Good evening. My name is Lauren Ortosky, and on behalf of the Alumni Club of Boston, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Harper Lecture. I graduated from the college in 2009 and currently serve as the career chair of the Alumni Club of Boston. I'm so glad all of you were able to join us tonight for this opportunity to dive into some UChicago scholarship and also have a chance to relax and socialize with like minds. Let me also take a quick moment to thank our Alumni Board of Governors, Alumni Schools Committee, Club Board, visiting committee members, and all of our alumni volunteers who have joined us today. Their leadership and your support is what makes these wonderful events possible. And now I'm pleased to introduce Professor Jens Ludwig. Jens Ludwig is the McCormick Foundation Professor of Social Service Administration, Law, and Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He is director of the university's Crime Lab and co-director of the university's Urban Education Lab. Jens is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences and a non-resident senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, where he is a co-director of its working group on the economics of crime. Jens has been awarded the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management's David Kershaw Prize for contributions to public policy by age 40. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ludwig.
Thank you. What a fancy introduction. You probably didn't expect someone to come up who looks like they're 16. So the alumni office asked if they could videotape the talk. I said, sure, so long as you airbrush me to make me look less tired and haggard and adjust the audio to make me sound even more like James Earl Jones. So I'm warning the ARD office, I'm going to check this online on YouTube when we're done to make sure you fulfilled your pledge. So thanks everybody for coming out. What better way to celebrate the University of Chicago getting the Obama Library than to come out and hear. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Cleveland. Thank you. Than to come out and hear about some work that the University of Chicago is doing to try and make Chicago a better place and not just Chicago a better place. The topic that I'm going to talk about is one that is enormously important in Chicago, but is really a problem around the world. That is crime, and especially violent crime. It's violent crime that really imposes the greatest social costs on society. So if you look around the world at the burden of violence, each year about 500,000 people are murdered around the world. So as a way to think about that, that's like taking every man, woman, and child in the city of Atlanta and slaughtering them year after year after year after year. And of course, millions and millions of other people are the victims of other crime. This is a problem that is enormously regressive in its impact. Well, so first of all, this is partly a problem that is unfortunately even more pronounced much more pronounced in the United States than in other developed countries. So the homicide problem is an important explanation for why life expectancy in the United States does not look nearly as good as what you would think compared to other developed nations, given how affluent we are. So homicide explains a big part of that life expectancy gap between the US and other developed countries. Within the United States, homicide is an important explanation for the disparities in life expectancy that you see between blacks and whites. One of the things that makes homicide such a particularly severe public health problem is one of the key success metrics that public health people use is years of potential life lost before age 65. And one of the things that is terrible about homicide is that the age distribution of homicide is so skewed young. So the population that is at greatest risk for homicide victimization is primarily men between the ages of, say, 15 and 24. And those rates, as I said, are much higher among African Americans than whites, much higher among poor people than rich people in the United States. If you look at black males in the United States, as many years of potential life before age 65 are lost from homicide as from the nation's overall leading killer of heart disease. So this is a first-order public health problem that is enormously important in Chicago, in Detroit, in St. Louis, in every American city. it also has enormous collateral consequences for people living in places like the south and west sides of Chicago. And so one of the things that we've been trying to figure out ways of conveying to people at the research center that I helped direct at Chicago called the Crime Lab is trying to get people to appreciate the degree to which violence makes so many of these neighborhoods completely unlivable. I've been working for many, many years on a HUD project that tries to help people get out of these neighborhoods. And the number one reason that residents of places like Englewood and Austin say they want to move is not for better jobs, not for better schools, not for better health care, not for better transportation. As critically important as all of those things are, they say it's for safety reasons. And it's not surprising, when you think about the violence problem, one of the key features of this that I think is very hard for most of us to realize is that victims are not the only victims. Everyone in a community is victimized by violence. Last summer, I don't know how many of you follow news in Chicago, but last summer, in July, there, on the west side of the city, some of you might have read about Shamia Adams, who was an 11-year-old girl at a sleepover who was about to sit down and make s'mores with her friend when a stray bullet fired by a gang member on the street went right through the gap in the open window and hit her in the head and killed her instantly. Now think about what life is like for any parent on the south and west sides after that. There is not a second that your kid is out of the house where you feel safe and secure. And after that event, there's not a second when your kid is in the house where you feel safe and secure. So this is not just a major public health problem. This is an incredibly important driver of disparities and overall well-being for every economically disadvantaged and socially disadvantaged person in the United States. So I think the other thing that is very important to have as a frame of reference in thinking about this problem is that it has also been incredibly persistent. So this is probably not the word. You can see that making graphs is not my specialty. This is not the world's greatest graph, but let me try and talk you through for a second what's going on here. So in the United States right now, we are patting ourselves on the back because violence rates are much lower today than they were 20 years ago. That, I think, sense of optimism and success reflects our very narrow time horizon in thinking about this problem. So this red line right here is the homicide rate per capita in the United States over the last 50 years, and you can see that it is true that over the last 20 years there's been some decline. But now step back and look over the longer term, over the last half century. These other lines here, these are the mortality rates per capita of the other leading causes of death in the United States. Heart disease, cerebrovascular mortality, so that's strokes, infant mortality. You can see there are many, many other causes of death that I could have put on the graph. Mortality rates from almost every major leading cause of death have plummeted over this last 50 years on the order of 50 to 75%, depending on exactly what cause of death you're looking at. Against that backdrop, it is enormously distressing that the homicide rate that we have today in the United States is almost exactly what it was like in 1950. So basically no long-term progress in addressing the violence problem. So one thing that this gets you to think, usually when we view such an important and persistent social problem, it is natural to jump to the conclusion that the problem must be intractable. And I think this is certainly what many people in the city of Chicago have come to believe in reading the Chicago Tribune every day. Literally every day, there are enough shootings in the city of Chicago where every day you would see a homicide or a shooting on the front page. Every day, day after day. It's understandable that people would start to feel this is intractable. What I want to do is illustrate some of the work that we've been doing at the Crime Lab that suggests that there might be other ways to make progress on this problem that we haven't thought about, that the problem might not be intractable, and in fact that we might be able to make some progress here by taking advantage of insights from behavioral economics and doing something as simple as getting people to just stop, look, and listen before they act. So you might be thinking that's completely crazy, but I'm hoping by the end of the talk, I will have brought you around to the idea that there really is something, something to this, maybe something very profound to this that might even change your sense of what the problem is about. Okay, so I think that it's important before we start thinking about what interventions you might do to address the problem to have some sense for what the problem actually looks like. So I hope everyone here has seen all 5 seasons of The Wire. If you haven't seen The Wire, you should run out of this lecture and just go to the nearest, I guess there are no more blockbusters, so you should go to Netflix and download The Wire and just, that will be way more informative and much more interesting than anything I would have to say. Those of you who have seen The Wire, you have this image of violence that many of us have from the media representations, right? It is Snoop Pearson and Chris Paltrow going out in their black SUV to do a hit against a member of Avon Barksdale's drug crew, right? So it is instrumental. It has some functional purpose, not necessarily a moral purpose, but a rational functional purpose. And it's premeditated. So if you think about The Wire, Snoop and Chris have construction equipment in the back of their SUV when they're going out to do a hit so that they can dispose of the body in an abandoned row house in Baltimore. Functional, premeditated. This is what violence actually looks like instead. So this is a more or less randomly selected example from the Chicago Tribune. This happened a couple summers ago, a few miles from my office at the University of Chicago in the South Shore neighborhood at 73rd and Coles Avenue. At 3 in the afternoon, there are 2 groups of kids who are out in the middle of 73rd and Cole woofing at each other about whether a kid in one of the groups had stolen a bike from a kid in the other group. And the 2 groups start to separate, so there's no self-defense rationale for what happens next, which is one of the kids pulls a semi-automatic handgun out of their waistband and fires into the other group and hits a 16-year-old kid named Jamal Lockett in the chest. The emergency medical services come and speed him down Lakeshore Drive to Northwestern's emergency room where he is pronounced dead later that day. So this actually is what most of the violence that we see on the south and west sides of Chicago and most American cities look like. So if you look at the Chicago Police Department annual homicide report, what you will see is 70% of the homicides where the police believe they understand what the motivation was stem from an altercation. This is what the problem looks like. Now, the thing that everyone in the city of Chicago and every big city around the country are deeply concerned about is understanding what we can do to prevent tragedies like this. And in order to think about what you can do to prevent the problem, you need to understand what's driving it. So why do we have tragic shootings like this? One common explanation that we hear over and over again, that all of you have read millions of times in the New York Times and the Atlantic and the New Republic, is that the violence is driven by poverty. So one version of the poverty argument is that when people are as poor, unfortunately, as they are on the south and west sides of Chicago, they become desperate. A different version of that, if you took an economics class at the University of Chicago, you might be familiar with Gary Becker's model of crime, where when people engage, the idea there is that when people engage in crime, they're doing some sort of rational weighing of benefits and costs. And so in this case, the standard economic explanation might say something like, if you feel like your schooling prospects and your labor market prospects are very low, you feel like you have little to lose, so the opportunity cost of engaging in crime is low, and maybe the resale value of a used bike on the south side of Chicago might be enough to push you over the edge. So that's one type of explanation that we've all seen in numerous forms. There's a different type of explanation that I know you've all heard as well, which was maybe most famously articulated in the 1990s in a Weekly Standard article by a professor named John DiIulio, who was at Princeton at the time and is now at the University of Pennsylvania. And DiIulio's explanation is what he called moral poverty. So let me just describe how DiIulio defines moral poverty. He says moral poverty is the poverty of growing up surrounded by deviant, delinquent, and criminal adults in abusive, violence-ridden, fatherless, godless, jobless settings. Whatever their material circumstances, kids of whatever race, creed, or color are more likely to become criminally depraved when they are morally deprived. That's an extreme view. So then Giulio argued that the result of those sorts of environments are what he called super predators, kids who no longer fear the criminal justice system and will kill without compunction. There are less extreme versions of that explanation that we read about every day in the newspaper. So there is almost no big city mayor that I have seen that does not, at some point when asked about the crime problem, lament the parenting and the yearning for better parenting, or more, let me say, more developmentally productive parenting for kids growing up in distressed neighborhoods like we have on the South and West Sides. So poverty and moral poverty. One I think, important so let me step back and just highlight an implication of the poverty and the moral poverty explanations that may or may not be obvious, which is both of those explanations are what you might think of as root cause explanations. So the argument is people are engaging in violence because they are exposed to this root cause factor, poverty or moral poverty. And as I'm sure will not be a surprise to anyone in the audience, both of those things are enormously difficult to change. We have been trying to reduce the poverty rate for a long, long time in the United States with very limited success. And it has proven to be enormously difficult for public policy and social science to figure out ways of substantially changing the kind of parenting that parents provide to children and the kind of developmental quality of the neighborhoods that we see in places like the South and West Sides of Chicago. So the logic of this is kids engage in violence because of root causes. The root causes are hard to change. The implication of that is the people that you see engaging in crime must be extremely committed to engaging in crime because they will continue to do that so long as the root cause is there in the background. Now, it's no surprise that many people have come to the conclusion that the people who engage in crime are committed criminals, because when you look at data from the criminal justice system in the United States, one of the things that you see is every year we have hundreds of thousands of people released from our state prison system. Fully 2/3 of them will be rearrested within 3 years. So of course you're going to think that criminals are committed to lives of crime when you see the same people getting arrested over and over and over again. So maybe Lindsay Lohan has reformed her life enough where this joke no longer resonates. Maybe the next time I do a Harper lecture, I'll replace this with a series of Michael Phelps mugshots. Maybe that will seem more current and salient to people. I would never use the Michael Phelps example in Baltimore. I'm too much of a chicken. What I want to do, so actually, let me also make one more point for this, which I think is very important. So many people have come to believe that root causes are the source of crime and violence. Many people have concluded from that the people who engage in crime are committed to lives of crime. If you are a policymaker and you are trying to address the crime and safety problem in the United States, and you believe that the people who do crime are deeply committed to engaging in crime, what would you do? One of the only things you might feel that you could do at that point is lock people up. And that is something that the United States turns out to be incredibly good at doing. So one of the things that most of you probably don't know, I certainly didn't know until I started to do research on crime, is that for most of the 20th century, the incarceration rate in the United States was shockingly constant. Crime rates would go up, they would go down, and the incarceration rate per capita was about exactly the same for decades, for most of the 20th century. And then starting in the 1970s, you can see the incarceration rate per capita just skyrocketed. Now, there are two things that I want to just point out about this graph. One thing that I want to point out about this graph is that many of you might believe that this increase is driven simply by changes in drug policy in the United States. So you might be thinking the solution to unwinding the criminal justice, the imprisonment population, is just legalize drugs. So I think one thing that is important, so setting aside your position on that policy change, I think one thing that is useful to know is, as best we can tell from the available data, only about a third of this increase is due to changes in drug policy in the United States. The United States has been locking up more and more people for almost every sort of crime over time. This is not just an issue about changing the way we treat drug cases. I think that is an important thing to keep in mind. Now, there's another point to keep in mind with this as well, and thinking about what we can do about this, which is, notice the incarceration rate has been increasing steadily for 30 or 40 years during periods when we have had Democratic presidents as well as Republican presidents. And this has happened in states that have had Democratic governors as well as Republican governors. So this really has been a bipartisan approach to addressing the crime problem for the last 40 years. We have really pressed down on the incarceration pedal, partly because people have had the sense that there's not much else we can do to address this problem. And so as a way to think about alternative approaches to relying on mass incarceration, I want to talk you through a different kind of hypothesis for why people are engaging in crime that comes out of a body of research within cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. And I think that this idea is easiest to illustrate through a little audience participation game, if you're willing to do it. If you do a lame job of this, it will be on YouTube for the Harper lectures forever. And I don't think that I don't want to go down in history, and you don't want to go down in history as the lame Harper lecture on YouTube. So I'm going to need you to really be very engaged in this. So here's what I need you to do. I am going to show you a slide with a colored object in the middle, okay? And what I want you to do is call out the color of the object when you see it, okay? So this is not super complicated. This is the sort of thing that they could even do at Harvard. For a price. Nicely done. We just have to make sure that no Harvard people know about the Harper lectures on YouTube, and we'll all be fine. Okay, so let's do an easy one to warm up. Okay, ready? So call out the color of the object when I flash it. Ready? Oh, we can do much, much better than this. Brown. I think brown. So that was black. That was the right answer. I know that we can do much better than that. Okay, so I'm going to go really, really fast, call out the color. Okay, ready? Here we go. Huh. What happened there? So why did we do that? So if you took a psychology class at the University of Chicago, you would recognize that as the Stroop test. That's probably the most famous test in all of psychology. So why did we do that? So one reason we did that is to check your reading level. It's nice that we, at the University of Chicago, we're very data-driven. We want to make sure there's not too much fade-out of the college experience on you. So I'm glad to see that you're all still literate. That's encouraging. The other thing about the Stroop test is one of my cognitive psychology friends told me that the CIA used to do this in recruiting spies. So what they would do during the height of the Cold War is that they would administer the Stroop test, and the last word would be in Russian. And if you called out the color, you were okay. And if you called out the word, they would send you down some other path of the screening process for, let's say, special attention. So the other reason that I administered the Stroop test is I want to make sure we don't have any Canadian spies here in the audience to. No. So here's what I think happened to those of you who said blue instead of orange or red, depending on your color orientation. All of you have developed an automatic response. All of you have developed an automatic response over the course of your lives to read a word when you see it. You don't even think about this. You don't think about doing it. And the reason that you have developed that automatic response is because it is adaptive. It is adaptive for almost every circumstance that you come into contact with. Now, notice what just happened here. I put you into a circumstance where reading the word is not adaptive. My instructions were not to read the word. My instructions were to focus on the color. So this automatic response that normally serves you so well turns out to get you into trouble when you come across a situation that you confuse with the type of situation that you're normally in. Now, what does this have to do with violence in Chicago? Imagine that you are a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old boy growing up on the south or west sides of Chicago. The sort of response that you might develop that is normally adaptive is, I can't let anyone think that I'm a pushover. If someone challenges me, I need to push back. I need to have a reputation as being the sort of person who's not a punk, or you can imagine what it's like in these neighborhoods. That sort of automatic response might be adaptive for the vast, unfortunately adaptive, for the vast majority of circumstances that a 16-year-old kid would come across on the south and west sides of Chicago, but can lead to tragedy when you have a semi-automatic handgun in your waistband. And that essentially is the key hypothesis behind a bunch of the work that we've been doing at the Crime Lab. So when we started the Crime Lab, the very first experiment that we did was a test of we held a design, we recognized that, nerdy University of Chicago professors sitting in their offices are not the best ones to design interventions that are going to connect and resonate with kids growing up in such difficult circumstances on the south and west sides of Chicago. So we held a design competition to identify the most promising ideas that were being carried out by nonprofits all around the city. And we selected a program called Becoming a Man that was developed by a Chicago area nonprofit called Youth Guidance. And I'm happy to talk more about what the program looks like during question and answer, but I think there are two sort of critical things that I just want to point out for now about the Becoming a Man program. So one thing that I want you to keep in mind about Becoming a Man is, it is not a vocational training program. It is not an academic remediation program. It is not a paid job. It is not early childhood. It is not one of the many, many things that you read about us trying to do to improve the life outcomes of poor kids. It is literally just trying to get kids to stop, look, and listen and slow down in the moment in situations where their automatic responses might lead to tragedy and get themselves into trouble. So that is what the intervention is really about. Very different from 99.9% of the other things that we try in social policy. And the second thing that is really striking about this intervention is that it is remarkably light touch. So it cost about $1,000 per kid. And they had the chance to participate once a week. They got out of a class to do this, so it's about an hour a week over the course of a school year. And the average kid who participated went to about half the sessions, which is about 13 contact hours. So really not very intensive. Now, you're going to be sitting there thinking, how in the world could such a light touch intervention that doesn't change the neighborhood circumstances, the family circumstances, the economic conditions, or anything of these kids growing up in these neighborhoods hope to have any impact on a problem that has been so persistent over 50 years. And so the other thing that's important to mention about this study is that we structured it just like a randomized control in medicine. We raised as much money as we could. We served as many kids as we could. Unfortunately, no matter how much private money we raised for this, the number of kids we could serve is dwarfed by the number of kids on the south and west sides of Chicago who need help. And so we did what the Chicago public schools do when they've got a school that more kids want to go to than can get in, which is do a lottery. That also turns out to be the way that in medicine we test new medical interventions, is basically do a randomized trial to convincingly identify the effect of the thing. So to describe let's see if this is going to work now. This is, we're on an AV high wire here. So to describe the results, I think what I'm going to have to do, to describe the results, I just want to turn it over for 1 second to our Crime Lab research spokesperson.
But I have read about and studied what BAM can do, becoming a man. And not only is it the mentoring, but when you look at the results, 40% are less who participate, less likely to be arrested for violent crimes, 40% less likely to fail their classes, and just participating, they are 10% more likely to graduate high school, and like RJ, they can actually see and envision college in their career, or in their future rather, and a career, and they're going to take it to 40 high schools serving 2,000 young men.
Okay, so that was Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, and there are a couple things about that video that I think are worth noting. So, one thing about it that was at Harper High School in Englewood. I was at the press conference, and I don't know if you could see the kid over the mayor's. I guess that's the mayor's right shoulder. I think his name was DJ. He was a BAM participant, and they asked him to introduce the mayor. So I can only imagine what Rahm Emanuel's life is like. It's like going from one public event to the other, where each introduction is more and more flowery and involved than the previous one. So they asked DJ to go up and say, what's special about BAM to you, and then introduce the mayor. And so, this kid at Harper High School gets up there and says, I'm DJ, I'm so grateful to be in the BAM program, here's the mayor. It was so wonderful because it was just such an authentic, it was just like the most authentic, wonderful moment you could ever imagine. I am sure the mayor has remembered that introduction. So here's one thing, you may or may not have been able to catch this from the video, but 1 year of participation in this very light touch program where the average participant goes to just 13 sessions reduces the rate at which these kids are arrested by violent crimes by over 40%. That is an enormous impact. That is an absolutely enormous impact. There's a second thing about that video that is really quite striking as well, which is when you think about the history of urban policy in the United States, going back for tens and tens of thousands of years to the very first caveman city, when the mayor of that first caveman city came under pressure to do something about the crime problem, what did that mayor and every successor mayor do? They would run and hold a press conference and announce some get tough on crime thing. And what we have just seen is the mayor of the third largest city in the country hold a press conference where part of his approach to addressing the crime problem is to invest a bunch of city money into scaling up a social program. And I think what is important about that is it's got to be the case that one of the reasons that the mayor feels like he has the political space to do that is because we have evidence, convince it to the extent to which we know anything in public policy and social science. This is about as good as it gets. A large-scale randomized trial showing us 40% reductions is about as good as it gets. And that essentially is a key part of our theory of social change at the Crime Lab, which is to take private dollars, rigorously test promising things, with the hope then of steering the government investment. So leveraging the private dollars to change how the government invests the billions and billions of dollars that they're using to address this problem. Now, you're a very smart University of Chicago audience. You might be thinking, well, I'm not impressed. How do I know that you guys didn't? Oh, actually, there's one other thing that I want to say about the impact before I talk about that. So the city has made the Becoming a Man, Youth Guidance is Becoming a Man program an important part of its anti-violence strategy. And then most of you probably remember a few weeks after President Obama's second inauguration, Hadia Pendleton, who is a CPS high school student who performed at the inauguration, was shot and killed in Kenwood, actually just a few blocks from President Obama's house. And then President Obama, a few weeks after that, came and gave a speech at Hyde Park High, which is just a few blocks from my house in Hyde Park. And as he's scheduling the visit, someone from City Hall talks to the White House and says, one of the things that the president should do when he's here is talk to the kids in the Becoming a Man program. And they had set aside 15 minutes in the president's schedule to talk to the BAM kids, and he was going to go out into the auditorium at Hyde Park High and give a speech. So, I finagled an invitation to the speech. I sat in literally the last row behind some very tall person whom I kept peeking around. And, the schedule says, be there at 2. The president's going on at 3. He's always on time. His schedule is ridiculously packed. He's going to go right back to the airport and fly back on Air Force One to meet Vladimir Putin or whatever the president does. So I'm there at 2. I'm there at 3, there's no president. At 3:15, there's no president. At 3:30, there's no president. At 4 o'clock, there's no president. Finally, the president comes on, and he gives his speech, and he goes out. And then Tony DiVittorio, the founder of BAM, this is Tony, he comes out afterwards, and I'm talking to Tony, and I said, how was meeting the president? And the first thing he said is, I think President Obama would be a good BAM counselor. The second thing he said is, I know that we got the same schedule as everyone else. I know that Obama was only supposed to spend 15 minutes with us, but he was there for an hour. And then the next spring, that spring, President Obama invited the BAM kids out to the White House for Father's Day. And then they came out to the White House another time after that as well. And the Washington Post said that becoming a man was an inspiration for the president's new My Brother's Keeper initiative. And so I think that it really is a very University of Chicago moment where it highlights the power of ideas and evidence to have really big social impact. Now, I know that you guys are a skeptical audience, so you might be thinking, convince me that this idea is right, for starters. You might be thinking maybe you just cherry-picked the easiest to work in school. So this is a map. For those of you who haven't been to Chicago in a while, this is the city of Chicago. The redder the community area, the higher the homicide rate. And the dots on the map are the high schools that we did this experiment in. So you can see these are high schools that are serving kids growing up in the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago. Well, you might be thinking, well, I'm still not impressed. Maybe within these neighborhoods, you cherry-picked the easiest to serve kids. You picked the Boy Scouts from Harper High School or Fenger or whatever. This is the average GPA of the kids that we worked with the year before we worked with them. This is the fraction of kids, on average they were age 15 when we started to work with them. This is the fraction of kids who had an arrest record by the time we started to work with them. 1/3 of 15-year-olds in these neighborhoods have a rap sheet already. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another thing that you're probably thinking to yourself is, well, maybe this nerd just got lucky. If you had a statistics class, that's what you might be thinking. Believe me, nobody is more surprised. Nobody is more surprised about this than an economist who works on crime, right? Economists don't think that behavior is this easy to change. And as someone who's been working on crime, such a persistent problem, how could it be that 1 year of this light touch, stop, look, and listen intervention has such big impacts? And so our goal in starting the crime lab is to make the world a better place. And so we want to be sure when we're going out and telling the policy people this is a promising strategy, we want to be sure that it's actually true. And so we're trying to convince ourselves as well. And so we did a follow-up study that raised the bar. So this, for those, I don't know how many of you have ever been down Roosevelt Road, past the Whole Foods, another mile or two, past the Whole Foods, past even the Costco. Then eventually you get to this building, which is the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. So this is where the highest risk juvenile arrestees in Cook County get taken as they're awaiting trial. And it's a 500-bed facility that has been incredibly difficult for anyone to manage for years and years and years. And the ACLU has filed a series of lawsuits against the county, arguing that it is just harmful to kids, that it's abusive and so on. And a few years ago, eventually a federal judge, in response to one of these ACLU lawsuits, stepped in and took over the facility and brought in an amazing guy named Earl Dunlap, who's a nationally known juvenile detention center reformer. And one of the first things that Earl did is he said, it's just not possible to manage a 500-bed facility. What I'm going to do, for starters, is treat it as if I am running 10 separate 50-bed facilities, and I'm just going to try and get a handle on one 50-bed facility at a time. And One of the things that he did then is he went to each of these 50-bed facilities inside the JTDC, and he tried to make them more developmentally productive. And so as discipline to try and reduce the temptation of the guards to physically abuse kids when the kids behaved, he implemented a token economy system. So if the kids are good, they get points. If the kids are bad, they lose points. And then on Friday night, if they have enough points, they can get an extra snack on movie night, or they can get extra time in the JTDC gym or something like that. He started to raise the educational requirements for the staff, and in the afternoon when the kids were not in school, rather than have them sit in the common room and watch TV, he would have them engage in this programming that basically just tried to get them to stop, look, and listen. So Earl is doing these reforms, one 50-bed unit at a time. He's through reforming about half of the 50-bed units when the Teamsters Union, which represents the detention staff, says, you know, there are a bunch of things going on here that are not part of our job description. And we're going to file a lawsuit that says that you must cease and desist. And a judge sees that complaint and says, it's not crazy. This complaint is not crazy. Earl, you must cease and desist. So now Earl is there with about half of his 50-bed facilities doing this new thing and about half doing the other thing. And so we go to Earl and say, Earl, how do you decide when these kids are coming into the facility, how do you decide which kids are gonna wind up in the new part and which are gonna wind up in the old part? And do you use a risk assessment or what do you do? And Earl says, you know, I think these risk assessments are very overrated, and I also believe it's very important for every unit to have a mix of kids. I don't like the idea of putting so he says, so it's basically arbitrary, the assignments when we come in. So we said, Earl, that's very interesting. Because you know, in many thesauruses, or thesauri, whatever the plural of the thesaurus is, in many thesauruses, a synonym for arbitrary is random. And why don't you let us take that very small step from arbitrary to actually random, and then you would know for sure as we can know in social science, whether your reforms are what you've been doing your whole career, whether this is really helpful to the kids. And more importantly, far beyond the city of Chicago, every juvenile detention facility all across the country that is wrestling with these questions would know as well. And so Earl is not just an amazing juvenile detention center administrator, but also incredibly open-minded and I think eager to have larger impact. He agrees to do this, and so there's a period of about 14 months where the 5,000 or 6,000 kids who come into the facility are randomly assigned to the new units versus the old units. And then we get data on the rate at which they return to the facility. And here's what you see when you look at that. So the blue bars here are the return rates. So the y-axis here is the share of kids who return within a certain amount of time, within a certain number of months shown along the x-axis. And the blue bar here is the return rates for the kids who go to the old style units within the facility, and the red bar here are the bars for the kids who are in the new style facility. And so I think there are just a couple of things to quickly point out here. So one thing that's worth pointing out is that when we went and we talked to the staff in the facility and said, how is it working? A lot of the staff were like, you know, we really like Earl. We're very sympathetic to what he's trying to do. It's just not making a difference for these kids. Now, when you look at this graph and you put yourself in the perspective of the staff in those new reform centers, you can see why they would think that. From their perspective, right, they're doing all of this program, all of this new stuff, and within 14 months, well over half of the kids are back again. If you take it out to 18 months, the fraction is even higher still. So they're seeing all of these kids over and over again. That's what it certainly feels like to them. What their eyeball estimate can't see is the difference. They're not seeing the alternative, the counterfactual here for what would have happened to these kids. And that is the power of the randomized experiment here. And with the experiment, you can see there's fully a 15% reduction in the rate at which these kids come back. And what's amazing about this is that the intervention is shockingly cheap. So think about what the marginal cost of this intervention is. You have the building. So the programming is delivered by the detention staff. You have the building, you have the staff, you have the kids, you have the common room, you have the time. The marginal cost of doing this is literally just the training to the staff and printing out the booklets for the curriculum, right? And so the benefit-cost ratio for this is just off the charts. So here's what I think, what I have started to conclude from this series of studies now is it really kind of gives you a profound reorientation about the nature of the problem and starts to get you to think that a lot of the violence being done on the south and west sides of Chicago is not necessarily being done by bad kids, but by kids who make bad decisions in the moment. And for me, this was perfectly crystallized by a staff member we talked to inside the JTDC on one of the visits, who said, he said, 20% of the kids in here are just dangerous. You let them out and they will do harm to other people. You have to lock them up, he says to us. He also says, but the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. And I think what we're learning from this research is that there are things that we can do to help kids better navigate these critical 10-minute windows that can reduce the harm to other people and also reduce the harm they're doing to them from their bad decisions. I think that if you think about the 40% reduction in violence is very encouraging. 15% reduction in return rates in the juvenile detention center is very encouraging, but those are not 100% reductions. Right? There's still, even if we did this, there's going to be far too much violence and arrest and rearrest on the south and west sides of Chicago. I think one of the challenges that one of the traps that a lot of us fall into, or one of the wishes that we have in this area, is we want to try and find the analog of the Salk vaccine for the violence problem. We want the one thing that we can do that solves this problem, and then we can move on to the next thing. And I think that's probably the wrong way to think about it. I think that the crime and violence problem, it's really a label for a very heterogeneous mix of things. And I think that we should not be thinking that we're going to find one thing that is going to address all of those problems. We need to be thinking, instead of a sort of a miracle cure, we need to be thinking that we're trying to get a golden portfolio of interventions that generate as much social good per dollar spent as possible. I think that there's kind of a bad news, good news takeaway from these series of studies. And so the bad news is, so the tragic news of this is, if you think about that graph before with the increase in the incarceration rate, you worry that we have harmed millions and millions of people's lives, perhaps needlessly, because we tragically misdiagnosed what is driving the problem. The good news, the optimistic news from this, is that we may be starting to get a glimpse of a much more effective and cost-effective and humane way of addressing the problem. So thanks very much. And I think we have time for questions, and the nice people at ARD are asking that you speak into the microphone because we're being recorded.
Hi, thank you for that terrific presentation. What do you think the ingredients were with these kids who met for 13 weeks is responsible for the tremendous change? Is it mentoring? Is it feeling appropriate? Is it someone is listening to them? The Hawthorne effect. Can you get into the granularity, and have you done any qualitative research?
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know what the Hawthorne effect, I'm sure because you're University of Chicago alumni, everybody knows what the Hawthorne effect is, but if you've forgotten what the Hawthorne effect is, it is the idea that just the simple act of being in a study might change your behavior. I don't think that this is, who knows? You don't know, but I would be shocked if this was the Hawthorne effect, because people have done hundreds of studies of different interventions to try and change the behavior of teenagers from disadvantaged backgrounds, and the huge majority of those studies show no effect. And so if Hawthorne effects were big things, we would have seen lots and lots of other studies show really big effects, so I'd be surprised if it was that. I would also be surprised, under similar logic, I'd be also surprised if it was a generic mentoring effect, because there have been lots of mentoring studies, and my reading of that evidence is that it's kind of mixed. I really do think that an important part of this is the getting the kids to slow down, to stop, look, and listen, and think about what sort of situation they're in. And maybe as one way to see this, I can just quickly talk you through the first exercise, or one of the first exercises that they do in the program, so you feel. So, all right, so there you are in Chicago public school, high school, and you get out of a class to go to the first session. And one of the first things that you will do is you will do something that they call the fist exercise. So they will pair people up, and one partner will get a rubber ball and they'll put it in their hand. And so there are like 12 or 15 kids in the group, and one of the kids will get the ball in the pair, and the BAM counselor will say to the other kid, you have 30 seconds to get the ball from your partner's hand. Go. So what happens? Most of the kids then basically beat the crap out of each other for 30 seconds. And then the BAM counselor will say, all right, let's switch. So now the other kid gets the ball, and now the other kid will beat the crap out of his partner for 30 seconds. And then the BAM counselor will say, okay, all right, let's reconvene, let's debrief and think about what you tried and what happened. And so the kids will come back together, and the BAM counselor will say to the kids, tell me what strategies you tried. And they will say things like, well, first I tried to pry his hand open, I think I broke his pinky, but I couldn't get the ball out, he's much stronger than he looks. And then I tried punching him a little bit, and then a little bit harder, and then I bit his ear. I mean, you can imagine what the kids are doing. Maybe not always that extreme, but you get the idea. And then, but I couldn't get the ball. And then the counselor will say something like to the kids, why didn't you ask? It was actually very profound that almost none of the kids ever ask. And they will all say some version of, if I would have asked, he would have thought I was a punk. He would have MF'd me. You could imagine, I'm not going to explain what MF means on YouTube, but you can imagine what, oh, you all know. Okay, oh good. Yeah, it is on the south side of Chicago, so you probably picked up what MF means. And then the counselor will turn to the other kid in the pair and say, so what would you have done if he'd asked you for the ball? And most of these kids will say, I would have just given it to him. It's just a stupid ball. Now, if you took a psychology class, you would recognize that as what psychologists call hostile attribution bias. Right? So that is, you have an automatic response that the other people have negative intent towards you, which is probably adaptive for most of the circumstances that you would face, unfortunately, often out in the community, but probably not so helpful when you're in a school setting. Right? So imagine you've got a teacher who's trying to push you to do your best. You think you assume the worst. In that school setting, you think she is just giving me a hard time because she doesn't like me. You can imagine how profoundly unhelpful that is for how you're doing in school, right? And so I think that is an incredibly clever type of exercise to get kids to really experience this thing that they do all the time out in the world and then reflect back on it. And I think it's these very clever kind of aha moments that, and really engaging to the kids that I think is an important part of it. Other questions?
You have these poor kids, and they're out in groups, and they commit violent crimes. In New England, we have these middle-class kids, and they're sitting at home alone, and they're ODing on heroin in huge numbers. Do you think there's any connection?
So, I think that if you have a background in psychology, you will recognize the different interventions that I described as versions of what psychologists call cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think what they have found is that different versions of CBT can be helpful for lots of different problems. And I think that substance abuse disorder is one of the types of behaviors that psychologists have had success changing with CBT or CBT-like strategies in other settings. And, I think that's another example where I think there are lots and lots of different reasons why kids are taking heroin. And some of those might be amenable to a CBT intervention and some are not, right? So, as one example, I bet a lot of the kids, well, who knows, but I bet some share of the kids who take too much heroin do something like I have had what I feel to be a catastrophic experience in my life. My girlfriend just dumped me, and so what I'm going to do is just forget everything about my life for the next whatever. I come home and I do a double dose or whatever it is, and then we have a tragedy. And that is a common kind of automatic response that lots and lots of us fall prey to, which psychologists call catastrophizing. We make negative events even more negative than they are, and that's the type of kind of automatic response that CBT can address that can help lots and lots of different problems. But so I think that different versions of these sort of automatic responses that can get us into trouble show up in lots and lots of different applications. It is not unique to low-income kids. I think one of the things that is unique to low-income kids is the variability in the sort of response that's adaptive to their situation. I think that's one of the things that makes it so hard to be a 16-year-old kid on the south side of Chicago, is the sort of response that's adaptive in school can be very different from the sort of response that's adaptive outside of school. Like, there's lots of education research showing that the problem for kids is that the teachers say, don't fight, and you get a low-income kid in a very tough neighborhood who a kid challenges them to a fight and they don't fight back, and they will get yelled at by their parents. Say, if you don't develop a reputation as the sort of kid who will fight back, you are not going to survive in this neighborhood. Now, get your ass back out there and go find that kid and show him what you're like. You can imagine you're a kid, actually, I let the keeper of the microphone, do it.
So the question about whether, it sounds like you're intervening with kids in roughly high school age, and I feel like a lot of kids are getting in trouble early, and the trouble itself has its own impact, and even if you can get some of them out of trouble by this intervention, you might have a higher success rate if you started earlier. Have you thought about starting earlier? Yeah,
it's a great question. The Becoming a Man experiment that we did, it actually, we're doing another big BAM experiment right now that's just with high school kids. But the first one that we did was with kids in grades 7 through 10. And the youth guidance people are of the view that kids are not cognitively capable really of doing the program or benefiting as much as they think kids need to benefit until 7th grade. And so, it is their program and we are respectful of their wisdom about the right thing to do. I think, I do want to say, I think that there are some difficult social policy trade-offs here that I think are a little bit subtle and we don't usually appreciate in terms of targeting interventions across the life cycle. So I think that there is this growing conventional wisdom in social policy right now that says that kids are very developmentally plastic when they're young. I have a 2-year-old, so I see this all the time. That's why I look as tired as I do. So the idea is that kids are so developmentally plastic when they're young, that's when we need to intervene. And if you haven't gotten them by 5 or 6, it's too late. And so that's why so much of the social policy discourse right now is how can we pour more resources into early childhood education? Now, a lot of the most socially costly social problems are things like criminal behavior, high school dropout, teen fertility. Those behavioral decisions don't show up until, usually starting at age 12 or 13, you start to see prevalence rates of those very, very harmful behaviors start to take off. So there are a couple difficult trade-offs here to think about. So it might be true that kids are more developmentally plastic during early childhood. My friend Larry Steinberg at Temple has written a new book called Age of Opportunity that questions that view, but let's assume for the moment that developmental plasticity is at its highest during early childhood. Intervening during early childhood is only going to change outcomes during adolescence if the impact of that intervention doesn't fade out over 10 or 15 years. On the other hand, if I am intervening with a 15 or 16-year-old kid during the stage of their life where dropout decisions, teen fertility, criminal behavior are at its peak rates, I don't care if the intervention goes away, the intervention effects go away after a year or two. I've had a big impact because I'm intervening in a much more proximate time period to when the behavior is. And so there's a trade-off right there between developmental plasticity and persistence of impact. There's another trade-off that's a little bit subtle, which is when you look at a bunch of 4-year-old kids for an early childhood intervention program, you don't know which, so one of the most famous findings in criminology is that about 6% of every birth cohort account for something like 60 to 70% of all the violence committed by that birth cohort. When you look at a bunch of 4-year-old kids, it is very difficult to tell which of the 4-year-olds will be in that 6%. Now, when I'm at the playground with my 2-year-old daughter, I feel like I can tell. But most people have a hard time figuring that out. On the other hand, when I'm looking at a 14 or a 15-year-old kid, and I can look back at their trajectory, their behavioral patterns in school, I can start to see the kids who are missing lots of school. I can see the kids who are getting into lots of fights and getting sent to the principal's office. And so my ability to target intervention resources on the highest risk kids goes up and up and up as I get more and more information about which kids are at highest risk. And so there's developmental plasticity traded off against targeting and reduced vulnerability to fade off. And my own view, it could be that early childhood programs are the place to double down and put all our bets. But I feel like we don't know that yet. I think that the early childhood bandwagon is a little bit premature in my view relative to where the state of the evidence is. It's a long answer, but I think it's a very important point. So you've got the microphone, whatever you think.
So I've had an opportunity to have several closed-door sessions with police commissioners and police chiefs at large cities with big problems. Invariably, behind closed doors, they say that their frustration is that when crime rates go up, they get more funding, but that their ability to prevent crime is very low. They react to crime. And they don't get a very good reception, of course, when they put that message out there to politicians and to the population. I'm wondering if you consider any kind of randomized study of the general population and politicians in particular to guide them towards, how to influence them to look at real data as opposed to take an emotional approach to preventing crime.
Yeah, it's interesting that a bunch of police chiefs would complain that they get more money when crime goes up. But there you have it. The world is full of surprises. I think that one of the very encouraging changes that we are seeing in public policy more generally is a shift towards more evidence-based policy. It is very, very slow. It is very, very slow, but the trend is clearly going in that direction. And to some extent also in policing. And so if you think like one of the innovations that almost every police department in the country does now is something called CompStat, which came out of New York City, and it involves using predictive analytics to identify where the problems are and focus resources and try and engage in more preventive policing rather than reactive policing. And that has started to diffuse. And so I think that we're seeing pockets even in policing of use of data and use of randomized experiments. It turns out to be even more complicated to do randomized experiments with police departments than in the public school setting or the social service setting. And so, this is something that the crime lab is working on doing with different cities around the country, but like the degree of difficulty is that much higher, but it's incredibly important because I think that there is clearly you're absolutely right that I think that there is a set of very smart, enlightened police chiefs who recognize that they need much better evidence to increase the social good per dollar spent in their budgets.
Right, and I would say that the frustration is that corresponding to the money, the expectation is that the crime is going to go down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that would drive, there are many, many things that would drive me crazy if I was a big city police chief. One of the things that would drive me crazy about if I was a big city police chief is that our performance measurement of how they do their jobs is pathetic, right? So how does any police superintendent get judged? It is, what does crime look like this year compared to last year? Now, imagine, that if you think about the homicide trend, I showed you a little bit of the homicide trend over time. In the 1980s, the homicide rate went crazy because of the crack cocaine epidemic. Every police chief in the country looked like an idiot during that time period. You don't know a lot of police chief celebrities from the 1980s. On the other hand, there are a lot of police chief celebrities from the 1990s when crime rate was dropping everywhere. Look at what I did in my city. My homicide rate dropped by 50%. Buy my book, hire my consulting company to come in and tell you what to do, right? And I think that, for starters, and I think getting just reporters, for starters, to be a little bit smarter about that issue, I think would be a great first step in educating the larger public. How much more time? I guess we've got a couple more minutes for questions? Okay.
Well, I think you may have answered the question. I guess I was interested in the possible parallel between the approach of getting young, potentially dangerous teenagers to, sort of think before they act, and that, minute of difference with police, and the extent to which the same kind of approach with police people can, maybe there's a parallel, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. One of the things that we heard from the juvenile detention staff is, they thought that one of the most useful things to come out of the CBT training that they did with the staff to deliver to the kids is to effectively CBT the staff. Yeah, because think about all of us all the time are having automatic responses that, again, and so I think that being a detention staff member is very, very difficult work. I think being a policeman on the south or west sides of Chicago, where there are lots and lots of guns and lots of people who unfortunately are carrying illegal guns around, is at least as challenging. And I think that is a very, very important idea that I think the field needs to then think about as the next step, is whether some sort of intervention like this could be helpful to address some of the challenges that I think everybody is recognizing right now around police-community relations, as we're seeing playing out in Baltimore and Ferguson and so many cities around the country.
Hi.
Yes.
So you mentioned the fact that these kids are acting this way because it's adaptive, like they're in a situation, they instantly react. And then you're training them to kind of stop and think, which is a new way of adapting in a different kind of setting. So when they go back to these neighborhoods in which the expectation is for them to react quickly to whatever's going on around them, how do they negotiate that? Like the ones who are coming from the juvenile center in particular, because they're going back to a situation where that's the way you survive.
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. I think one of the important points around with these interventions is, it's counterintuitive or even weird to say, is the interventions never tell the kids don't fight. Which is, I think that you have to sort of pull yourself out of your normal mindset to appreciate what that really means, and actually kind of how profound it is that they never tell the kids not to fight. And also what a sad statement it is about these communities, that the programs don't tell the kids to never fight. So they don't say don't fight. What they say is, think about the situation that you're in and whether this is a situation where you should fight or not, right? And program providers will say, sometimes you're out on the street and you're challenged and you just gotta go, right? But when you are in math class and your teacher tells you to sit down, Jens, shut up and sit down. Sometimes a teacher will be a little bit sharper than they need to. Jens, shut up and sit down so we can start math class. If I have the same kind of automatic response to that I would out on the street when someone says, hey, idiot, give me your effing phone or whatever it is, I'm going to get myself suspended or expelled, and that's not going to be very helpful at all. And so I think that is just a very, very important, what they do is they have the kids recognize what are the changes. So the changes in moods that kids experience are one of the signals to them about when they should be slowing down and really making sure that they are construing the situations correctly. So if I feel very, very pissed off, sometimes it's entirely appropriate for me to be pissed off, but let me just stop for just that 1/2 a second and make sure that this is a situation where I really should be pissed off.
We have time for 2 more
Two more
questions.
questions, okay.
Can you comment on the validity of the concept that was popularized by Stephen Levitt in his book Freakonomics, where he mentions that there is a negative association between the rate of abortion and future crime rate?
Oh, great, a nice non-controversial question. Not only is it a nice non-controversial question, but now it's going to go up on YouTube as well. So, the answer to that question is different from what do I or you or anybody think about abortion policy. So let's start off kind of separating those two questions and just focus on the empirical question of whether abortion legalization in the early 1970s contributed to the drop in crime starting in the early 1990s. I am one of the people, there's a big debate in social science about whether that's true. I'm one of the people who's convinced. And let me tell you why. It has turned out to be very difficult to, so right around the time that the first birth cohorts exposed to legalized abortion started to reach peak offending age, that's about when the crack bubble burst. And so it has turned out to be very, very difficult to tease apart the popping of the crack bubble and abortion legalization onset, looking at that data. But other researchers, including John Gruber at MIT, looked at data from the 1980 census, well before John Donahue and Steve Levitt looked at the abortion crime hypothesis. They looked at data at the 1980 census, and you could already see in the 1980 census that the birth cohorts that were exposed to abortion legalization, on average, had less disadvantaged home environments as of the 1980 census. And we have a large body of research correlating those family characteristics to later crime outcomes. And so for me, even though it's hard to tell from looking at the 80s and 90s data, I feel like that 1980 census kind of forecast the Levitt-Donahue finding that would come out many years later. So that's my own sort of personal view. And I guess the last question.
Just keeping it controversial, I'm curious about what role you feel that Americans' gun laws play in the prevalence of gun violence in our country. As I understand it, our nation has similar rates of general crime and similar rates of mental illness compared to other developed nations, but we have about 19 times the rate of firearm fatalities.
Yeah, so I think that no serious social scientist would disagree with the claim that gun involvement in violent events increase the chances that someone winds up dead. It took social science a while to converge on that conclusion, but there you have it. Hopefully no one will ever have this choice, but if you had the choice of being shot or stabbed, you should pick stabbed. So that's news that you could take away, news that you could use from the Harper lecture. Let me say the challenge and then maybe I end the whole thing on a slightly, hopefully more optimistic note, which is, as everyone here knows, the city of Chicago has had among the most stringent gun laws in the United States for a long, long time. And that it's not clear that that has had the impacts in reducing gun availability that many have hoped. And I think one of the ways to think about that is, my family lives in New Jersey, and every Thanksgiving, before we had our second kid, we would drive to New Jersey and then back again. We would drive through Pennsylvania. We would drive through Ohio. We'd drive through Indiana. We'd wind up in Illinois. We'd drive across state lines, city lines. Nobody ever stopped us and checked the trunk of our station wagon to see what we had in there. For instance, whether the trunk was full of Glock 9mm new in the box that we might want to sell on the south side of Chicago for our daughter's college fund. We wouldn't do that, but there'd be no one, I mean, if you look at the cost of college, you could, but we would never do that. I think of this problem, you know, none of the guns that are used in crime in Chicago were bought in Chicago. They all come from somewhere else. I think of the gun regulation problem as being a lot like environmental regulation, where there are very important cross-jurisdictional spillovers. And the way we usually think about regulation in those sorts of environments where there's lots of cross-jurisdictional spillovers is that's an argument for regulating at a higher level of government, like at the national level. Now, all of us are reading, whatever your politics on the gun control issue, we're all reading the same newspapers. And there is so much gridlock around this at the national level, I would be shocked, myself, if we see big changes to national gun laws in my lifetime or maybe even my daughter's lifetime. Now, that might make you feel totally pessimistic. Now, the reason that that makes you feel totally pessimistic is because 99.9% of the public discourse around gun violence and gun availability to criminals in the United States is about gun control. It's like World War I trench warfare. One side and the other side, lots of carnage, but the front lines never move on this issue, not very much. But there's a different part of this problem. Almost none of the criminals who use guns to commit crime bought their gun right from a gun dealer. So one implication of that is that there is some sort of distribution network, some sort of underground distribution network through which the gun goes from whoever it was that bought it at the gun store to someone else, and maybe someone else, and maybe someone else, until it winds up in the hands of a shooter. That distribution chain is in principle the target for intervention, and the person who can intervene on that distribution chain is a police chief who has an enormous amount of technocratic flexibility. Superintendent McCarthy, the superintendent of Chicago Police Department, he can take his gun team tomorrow and move it from neighborhood X to neighborhood Y, or redeploy them from working retail buy and busts in the gun market to targeting wholesalers, or whatever he wants to do. There's no political constraint on Superintendent McCarthy in his ability to crack down on the underground gun market. The thing that is challenging for the police is neither the police nor the social scientists have any idea how the hell these underground gun markets really work. And so one of our big projects right now is to try and understand that so that the police chiefs then can be turned loose to try and do something about that. So let me end on that hopeful note that there is something that we might be able to do about the gun availability and gun violence problem as all of the heat and light on the gun control issue continues to dominate the newspaper headlines. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming.